What's up everybody? Right now I'm here on the beach in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and today I want to share with you 7 things you need to know before coming to this iconic city.
So the first thing I think people should know before traveling to Rio de Janeiro is how I would describe this city in one word, and I would say that it's extreme. And that's a both positive and negative thing. On the positive side of things, I think it's extremely beautiful. There's so much nature and so many beaches. It's incredible. It's very colorful and vibrant and exciting and fun. And you can just do so many things. There's so many extreme sports you can do. You can take helicopters. It's very historic and interesting, and there's just so many awesome things in Rio. And it's also extremely hot as well, so there's good weather. But on the negative side of things, it can be very, very loud and chaotic. I think it's an overwhelming place to visit for a lot of people. And there's also a lot of inequality. There's a lot of rich people and a lot of poor people. There's a homelessness issue. And basically, based on the neighborhood you're in, you can tell if it's rich or poor. And it's very unequal in that way. And finally, that also leads to it being extremely unsafe in certain areas, definitely depending on which neighborhoods you're in. If you're going into the favelas, if it's really late at night, it can be very unsafe, so you have to be aware of your surroundings as well. So it's extremely positive and negative visiting Rio, and you should know that before you come. And moving on to the second thing you should know before coming to Rio, and that is safety. This is probably the biggest question I got asked by a lot of people when I said I was coming to Brazil, and it's a very important thing to keep in mind when you're traveling here. In my last video that I made about Sao Paulo, all the comments, half of them were saying that it's a super underrated place to visit and it can be very safe, and the other half are saying that I'm going to get robbed everywhere I go. So it's definitely up for debate. And in Rio specifically, I'd say that it's very dependent on where you go and at what time, like I already mentioned. So if you're sticking to the Zona Sul, the southern part of the city, and specifically areas like Copacabana, Ipanema, Leblon, Botafogo, and so forth, you'll be totally fine. But in other areas like in Central and downtown, it depends on the time of day. Downtown can be safe and perfectly fine during the day, but if you're there at night, it can be very unsafe. And as I mentioned before as well, going into the favelas is definitely a volatile experience. And if you're doing things like flashing valuables, or you're clearly unaware of your surroundings, or you have your phone out of your pocket, it can be an unsafe place to visit. So I'll be honest saying that Rio is hit or miss, but if you know where you're going and you take the proper precautions, you'll be totally fine. And now moving on to number 3, which is getting around. So there's different transportation methods you can take in Rio, like any city, and each of them has their own positives and negatives. So the best and most efficient way to get around in Rio, and for a lot of Brazil, is by Uber. And it's not very expensive compared to other countries. Taking Uber in Rio will cost anywhere from around $3 to $10, maybe more than that if you're going a long distance, but generally between those prices. And it's really safe and really efficient. And everyone I met on Uber was super nice and very easy to talk to, and it made for a great experience transporting with Uber. And then the other way, if you're kind of on a really tight budget, you can also use Uber Motorcycle, which is the cheaper version. Obviously, it might not be as safe as a regular Uber, but you can take motorcycles for even as cheap as $1, all the way up to maybe $5 to get around the city faster on a motorcycle and not in a car, but it's very cheap and affordable. There's also a metro in Rio, but it doesn't really go everywhere. So that's kind of hit or miss depending on where you want to go. If you're going to a specific place and you look on Google Maps, you can tell where the metro is going, and it can be really easy, and it's pretty safe and clean as well. So you can use the metro, but it might not go exactly where you're going, so you have to be aware of that and research it before you start on your journey. And finally, there are also buses, but honestly, I found those to be hard to understand without speaking Portuguese. And it was kind of just difficult to know when they were coming, where they were going, and the buses were much more of a headache. If you want to try it and go on an adventure, and feel free to use it, or if you speak Portuguese, it'd be easier for you. But otherwise, I'd recommend sticking to the metro or using Ubers to get around. And I forgot to mention that there's also taxis, the regular yellow cabs, you can take those. But once again, if you don't speak Portuguese, a lot of the people don't speak English, so it'd be difficult to kind of talk to the cab driver, and it would also be more expensive than Uber because it's less of a set price, and you kind of have to deal with the cab driver and kind of negotiate or have them run the meter and see what it would cost you. And now moving on to number 4, which is the English level. Another thing that I heard a lot about before going, but I had to see for myself what it was like. And honestly, Brazil has been one of the harder countries for me to communicate in without the English level being so good. So there's a big language barrier. I've definitely noticed a low English level, and even in Spanish level as well. I know some Spanish, and I tried to communicate with that. And it's kind of similar to Portuguese, where you can understand some things like numbers or certain things they're talking about, but it's not close enough where it's easy to communicate. So basically, it's essentially only Portuguese, And if you're trying to use English or Spanish, it might be difficult for you, and any other language might be impossible. So you're gonna want to know that going forward, and make sure you're using your language apps or communicating in different ways. And now moving on to number 5, which is Christ the Redeemer. Obviously, there's a world wonder in Rio de Janeiro that makes it an even more extreme place to visit. They have so many cool spots. But there are many different options for how you can approach Christ the Redeemer on your visit. And the first one, which is the one I did, was taking the train for around $20, and I took it from the station at Cosme Velho. I believe that's what it's called. I'll write it in the screen below. And it's super safe there. There's a lot of people around. There's security, and it was very easy. You can just walk right up to the ticket counter and buy tickets, or you can go on the official website and buy them before you go and just show your phone, and you'll be able to get on the train no problems. And that was very simple because it takes you right up from the bottom to the top, and then you're right at the top, and you can use the stairs up the rest of the way, which isn't that many. And there's also even elevators there, so it's very accessible for people who can't really walk up the stairs as well. Then there are other options as well, such as taking tours. This is obviously going to be the most expensive option, but there are a lot of packages where you could have tours pick you up right from your accommodation and drive you directly to the top and take you there and handle everything to make it easier for you. And then you can also have a guide with that as well, so they can talk to you about the history and the culture and everything, so you'll learn more on that experience. So the tours are a pretty good way to do it, but it's going to be the most expensive one. And then a third option for Christ the Redeemer is using the vans. So there's multiple points in Rio where you can find the vans that will take you to the top of Christ the Redeemer, and you can get your ticket through them as well by paying for it. I didn't use this method, but I did know a friend who used it from Copacabana, and I believe it was near Pracadolido. I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, but it's at Posto 2 near the beach, and it costed him about $18 to $20 for the ticket and the van ride up to the top. So that's another way from the train or tours, just taking a van to the top as well. And then finally, the fourth option, and this is the most heavily debated one, and that is hiking up. And it's possible from the trailhead in Parque Laga, but this is heavily debated because there's many different things to consider when doing this. Firstly, it can get incredibly hot in Rio, like I mentioned. And because it's so hot, the hike takes approximately 3 hours. So if you want to be hiking 3 hours through the heat, it can be very difficult for you if you're not prepared for that. Bring a lot of water and make sure you know what you're doing. And the second thing is that this is been a bit of an issue in the past because there have been some high-profile cases of robberies happening on the trail. And I've heard that in recent years, they've really done a lot to combat this, and it's much safer now. You'll see other people on the trail, and it's an easier and safer thing to do than it used to be. But just know that a lot of people have had issues with that, and might not want to bring all of your valuables with you on the trail because there's potential for an unsafe situation. But overall, I think that's still cool for budget travelers because you can get the ticket cheaper by hiking up, only paying the entrance fee, or you can have a great adventure and story to tell in the future that you hiked all the way up from the bottom to the top of Christ the Redeemer. And now moving on to point number 6, which is Sugarloaf Mountain. This is the second most visited tourist attraction in all of Rio after Christ the Redeemer, but there are also different options you can take to get to the top. So traditionally, to get there, and the easiest way to do it is to take 2 separate cable cars. The first will get you halfway up, and then you'll take another one to the top. But this is very expensive and costs around 195 reals now, which is the equivalent of around $34. So firstly, if you're on an extremely tight budget, you can actually get a part of this experience for free by hiking up to the smaller mountain, which is Morro da Urca. I believe that's how it's pronounced. And there's a trail you can find on Google Maps or even on all trails. You can Uber there, take other transportation to get there, and then you can hike up to the first mountain. And even at that section 1, you get incredible views of Rio, and it's a cool experience. There's a lot of different shops there, and you can get part of the experience completely free by hiking up there. And then your reward for walking to the top of the first hill is that you've already reached the start of the second cable car, and you can buy a ticket there for a discounted rate to take you fully to the top of Sugarloaf Mountain. But for the heaviest of budget travelers, you could simply take in the views at this section and then not pay a single cent and walk back down, or pay a small fee and take the cable car back to the bottom without even going to the top of Sugarloaf. I wouldn't recommend this because the experience is totally worth it, but if you really don't want to take any cable cars on this trip, that's something that you can do and save some money. And now moving on to the 7th thing you should know before you go to Rio de Janeiro is the fact that weather can change very quickly in the city, especially in the summer, which is technically the rainy season. This happened to me personally when I was planning to spend some time at the beach in the middle of the day. It was really hot outside. It looked sunny outside. I checked the weather. Everything said it would be sunny. Got to the beach and it was great. But then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a huge rainstorm happened. I wasn't prepared for it. I had to duck for cover. And it was a very interesting experience. And that's something you want to keep in mind if you want to do Sugarloaf Mountain or Christ the Redeemer. You're going up to these places and you're not prepared for weather change. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, it might happen. And then you have to figure out what you're going to do. So I'd say be prepared, really research the weather, and know before you go, because especially if you're going to Christ the Redeemer, it can get very cloudy up there. And if you're not prepared for that, it kind of can ruin the experience and the views. So you're going to want to really research before you go, or be prepared for the changing weather patterns. But all right, everyone, those are 7 things that you should know before you go to Rio de Janeiro. I'm not Brazilian. I'm a tourist who went there and experienced the city for myself. I think it was an incredible experience. I highly recommend everyone goes to Rio. Just take proper precautions, know what you're getting into, and you're going to have a great time while you visit that amazing city. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys on the next one.